Good? Leslie, you feel good? We're recording. It's happening. Just so folks know, we are recording tonight. So if you would prefer to not have your image saved on the library website for the future, you can definitely just stop your video. But welcome everybody. So nice to have you here this evening. My name's Art Middleton, and I'm the Forbes Library Writer in Residence. And I'm so grateful to be hosting tonight and to have Leslia and Sally here with us. And thank you all for attending. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Forbes Library stands on Nonotuck land. And in our presence here, I'd like to acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We would also like to pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past and present, of those communities, and any others who may be here today. This is and always will be Indigenous land, and we're grateful to the scholarship of historian Lisa Brooks, as well as Vixie Utzler and Ian Miller, upon whose research this acknowledgement draws. If it's not already popping up on your screen, live transcription is available. There should be a little transcript button on the bottom of your screen. You can hit that. And if you so need it, it's there for you. Tonight, we're celebrating the release of two new books, Leslia's I Wish My Father and Sally's Fishwives. And I'll post a link to the books in the chat if you'd like to learn more about them, or hey, wild idea, even buy them. I'm going to just throw that in here. There you go. Easily clickable. I also want to mention right before we get started that today saw the release of the first episode of an audio series that I've been making for Forbes called Our Work and Why We Do It. That came out of this reading series that I've been running in person that with the pandemic kind of dissipated. This first episode features a reading and conversation with the one and only Susan Stinson, who is gracing us with her presence this evening, and whose characteristic warmth and brilliance make the episode so worthwhile. I do hope you'll check it out. It'll be available on streaming services, hopefully by the morning. We're just waiting for iTunes to verify that it's not lascivious in any way. So it should be up tomorrow, but it's available now on SoundCloud for streaming and downloading. And I'll send the little link there as well. So with that, let's get started with our readers for the evening. I'm going to introduce them, introduce Sally first, who's going to read first, and then we'll follow it up with Leslia. So Sally Bellerose is a grandmother, gardener, and retired RN. Her novel Fishwives was published by Bywater Books just this month, and her novel The Girls Club won many awards, including an NEA fellowship. Her poetry is featured in Lady Business from Sibling Rivalry Press. She lives here in Northampton, and we're so thankful to have her here with us this evening. Sally, let's do it.
There, I'm unmuted. Thank you. Thank you, Art, and thank you, Molly, and thank you, Forbes, for having us, and thank you all for listening and for coming tonight. I'm so happy to be reading tonight with my friend, the talented and generous Leslia Newman, to celebrate our books. Leslia's beautiful I Wish My Father, and my own Fishwives. I don't know if you can, I think you can see the covers, because I want to show the covers because I love the covers of these books. I think the covers of both of them are beautiful and elegant and provocative. And I think they set the emotional tones for the books. The Fishwives cover is by an artist named Anne McMahon. And I think she beautifully captures the mood of the novel, which is about four elderly women named Jackie and Regina, who reminisce about their past as they drive to a dump in the snow in the winter in a decades-old car that they need a screwdriver to get into here. And there's a Christmas tree strapped to the top of the roof. It's a book about aging, class, sexuality, love, and loss. But mostly it's a book about the stories they tell each other to make sense of their lives. The obvious symbol of the evergreen twig, I'm going to show it to you one more time because I love this cover. The obvious symbolism of the evergreen twig on the cover is longevity. Regina and Jackie have been together for over 20 years, so they have longevity covered. But my two favorite symbols that the little twig of evergreen represents are continued relevance and a place to seek shelter. I think always, but especially as we age, most people long for continued relevance. And as the world presents new and probably ever always has presented evolving challenges, we all need a place to shelter. And I think that's what we do when we keep our stories alive for each other, is help each other find relevance and a place to shelter. And so if you happen to be a writer, you would probably find relevance and shelter through the written word, and perhaps what Leslia and I are trying to do tonight through poetry or through story. So as I was pondering how our readings might complement each other, knowing that Leslia was reading her beautiful poems in verse about her dad, I started looking for the stories that in my novel, that these two elderly women evoked from each other as they were driving to the dump. I was looking for stories about their father. And it turns out they had so many stories about their father that I had a hard time choosing which ones to tell. So I decided to focus on Jackie's father because she had a very remarkable father and she had a very close relationship with him. And I had a remarkable dad myself. My dad was very hardworking, quiet. He was just a decent guy and he was also a guy who didn't necessarily understand why his kids did some of the things we did. But my dad did understand unconditional love, even though he probably never even heard the term. And he was also a man with a really unique sense of humor. So I'm going to start off with a short piece in honor of my dad, and then read passages about Jackie, the character from Fishwives. So I'm going to start out with a piece called Dead Man's Float. It's very short. It's in honor of my dad, George Merrill Bellerose. This is, I wrote when my dad was 91 years old. At the time he was on kidney dialysis. So it's a short piece of creative nonfiction. Dead Man's Float. Dad is sprawled on the lazy boy, head dangling, mouth open, playing dead. His color is not too good to begin with, so it's pretty convincing. I'm on the couch, knitting. Cut it out, Dad. I poke his shin. He's already been asked politely to knock it off twice. Fortunately, the slightest grin crosses his lips. Otherwise, I'd have to get up and check his pulse. This is one of his better performances. Since I'm not responding to death, once in a while he twitches to demonstrate he could be in the throes of something significant, but short of dead. Like a heart attack or a stroke, maybe. He's already had 2 of each. You're not funny, Dad. How are you going to like it if you do kick the bucket and everyone just keeps on knitting? Actually, if I was in a better mood, I would find his stunt funny. Sometimes I play dead myself. It's a good way to fall asleep. Playing dead is a family tradition that was started on Haviland Pond, where Dad taught all of his 4 children to swim. Lesson 1 was the dead man's float, the joy of lying in the water on your belly, face submerged, that other world gone for a minute, 2 minutes. Then the slow seep of air out the side of your mouth, dangling there alone in your own world for 3 minutes. With practice, 4 minutes. 4 minutes to straddle the here and there. The object of the game, to fool a nearby swimmer, preferably a sibling, into thinking that you're gone for good and springing out of the water and screaming and gasping. What could be funnier? Maybe the thrill of being on the receiving end of the game, finding your sibling dead in the water, wading over to the corpse, the delicious horror of it, the short window of time when you convince yourself that maybe she is gone and congratulating yourself bravely for facing the body. I keep knitting. Dad keeps floating with his eyes closed on his lazy boy. My sister Kathy stops by on her way to choir practice. Hi, Dad. She kisses the top of his head. He's dead again, I say. Oh, that's too bad, she said. I brought blueberry pie. She puts a pastry box on an end table right near him. His nose twitches. She straightens his head and gives me a look. Death by crick of the neck. She raises a scolding eyebrow at me. You're a pain in my neck. I grin at her, just a little. She's knitting a scarf for a dead man, she whispers in Dad's ear. Dad's eyes pop open. Boo, he yells. Dad, she exaggerates the squeal, making his day. His eyes dart to the pastry box. Any crap in that? He means sugar substitute. No, Dad, no crap, she says, which I know for a fact is not true. Oh, she's a liar, Dad, I say, pouting, because I have been sitting here knitting for a dead man all afternoon, and my sister got the boot. So that was my dad. Now I'm going to read, as I said, I'm going to Fishwife's and Jackie's dad. This is an excerpt from chapter 11, I'm sorry. Jackie and Regina are in their 70s in this piece, and Selma, who is Jackie's niece, is about 10 years younger. This is September 2011. Could it be? Yes, yes. It's been 12 days since the planes hit the, it's been 12 days since the plane hit the Twin Towers. Jackie sits on the side of the cranked up hospital bed, holding her 98-year-old father's hand. He's been dead for 20 minutes, maybe more. The hospice nurse smiles at Jackie as she walks by the room. Her father has taken weeks to die, and Jackie is still not ready to share his death with the soft-spoken young nurse, so she smiles back. She kisses her father's hand, still warm in hers, and wonders how long it will take his hand to become cold. Au père, she whispers. Hoping her niece Selma and Regina get here soon, hoping the Mercury tracer hasn't died on its way to or from the station, hoping Selma made her connection. Less than an hour ago, making an account of his survivors, Dad had said in a raspy voice, "Just you and Selma left." Jackie felt the absence of Regina's name as more weighed on a pile of loss. Her father blinked and added, "And of course, Regina." Then he closed his eyes, and Jackie closed her eyes too. She thinks they were both sleeping when he died. Her mother has been gone for 14 years. Jackie does the math to figure out how long her brother's been gone. Could it be 40 years? She stares at the fine wrinkles on her father's face and notices for the first time that even the bridge of his nose and his eyelids are wrinkled. His only grandchild, Selma, is not here yet. They haven't seen her since Jackie's mother died. Jackie has the absurd thought that she'll have to remember details about what Selma says, how she looks, so she can accurately report back to her father. She squeezes his hand. "Sorry, Dad." She has failed to get Selma up from Georgia in time to say goodbye. Jackie closes her eyes, and the damn letter the Army Inquiry Board members sent her parents a half century ago pops into her head. She sighs, "Bastards," under her breath, remembering the sentence from that letter that she will never forget. "We are sending your homosexual child home." It wasn't bad enough they got rid of her. They put it in writing and sent a letter ahead of her, dishonorably discharged. Almost killed her mother, damn near killed Jackie and her father. So proud of her in his quiet way when she signed up. Since she was 12, her father knew what she was and who she was. He found her and Susie Norris in the pantry, took them to the barn, Susie shaking, expecting a beating. But what they got was a shake of her father's head and the sad truth. You girls are going to get the shit beat out of you. Anybody but me finds you like that. Only time her father ever said shit in front of Jackie. And after his homosexual child was sent home, he took her fishing and never spoke of her time in the service again. His only living child, and the bastards wouldn't let her make him proud. Now, Jackie crosses the hand she's been holding over her father's chest and studies the IV pool. The bag containing morphine is half full. She's not sure, but thinks something bad might happen to his arm if the fluid keeps dripping into his vein after his heart has stopped pumping. She reaches for the plastic stop on the tubing and squeezes it shut when the click-clack of high heels on the linoleum announces that Regina and Selma are approaching. Jackie's head swivels towards the sound. Regina leads, but steps aside at the door to let Selma enter the room first. Jackie places her father's other hand across his chest and stands to greet them. Selma gives Jackie a desperate look. Her hand flies to her mouth. He's gone? Regina asks, knowing the answer. I'm sorry, Selma. I'm sorry, Jackie, we tried. It had taken them 2 weeks to track Selma down. She was on another religious retreat, this time visualizing the souls of 3,000 victims from 9/11 being uplifted as Selma and the rest of the faithful erected a spiritual safety shield around the United States. When Selma finally heard that her grandfather was dying, she was anxious to come, but didn't have the bus fare. Jackie and Regina scrounged up the money for a ticket, but not soon enough. Auntie, Selma says, oh, Auntie Jackie, I'm so ashamed. Staying away so long. Y'all were so good to me when I was little. She throws her arms around Jackie. The distance between Georgia and Massachusetts is the same north to south as it is south to north, Jackie says. We should have made more of an effort too. Your name was on his lips just before he passed. Selma kneels by her grandfather's bed and takes his hand. Her face brightens. His spirit hasn't left his body yet, Auntie. No, Jackie can hear. Jackie can hear the nurse's med cart. Excuse me. Jackie can hear the nurse's med cart clanking towards them, stopping a few doors down. I don't know much about these things, Jackie says. We can pray for him, help his spirit move on. Will you pray with me? Selma places her skinny black purse on the end of the bed at her grandfather's feet. She wears a powder blue pantsuit in the style that Jackie remembers from the 80s, maybe the 70s. Selma is round, all bump and curve, with a head full of well-controlled hair. She looks even more like Jackie's mother now than she did 14 years ago. Of course we'll pray with you, Regina says, kneeling. She gestures with her eyes for Jackie to kneel next to them and moves closer to Selma. But Jackie kneels at the foot of the bed, bending her right leg so her right foot is flat on the floor and the bad knee doesn't have to bear her weight. Jackie has always wondered how Regina, with her radical politics, is always so willing to dip into religion. Religion, traditional, new wave, east or west, God and all his or her or whoever's glory, has always seemed to Jackie a distraction, a way to avoid the impossible work of shepherding the world directly towards peace and justice. She hopes Selma doesn't get into any of her moaning and writhing. Her father hated that shit, but kept his peace about it, at least to Selma, as Jackie will do now if it comes to that. Selma prays. Catholic prayers that both Regina and Jackie know and join in on. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault, striking their breasts on every fault. Selma does a little chanting. She sings Alleluia, a Leonard Cohen song, one of Jackie's favorite, a song Regina associates with the dark side of relationships, and Jackie associates with the slippery bitch of erotic desire. Jackie has just thought of that phrase and wants to remember it so she can repeat it to Regina. A slippery bitch of desire, if ever there was one. This phrase makes Jackie grin inappropriately. She lowers her head, appreciating Selma's delivery of Alleluia in her solid, sincere voice that hasn't lost a bit of its high emotion since she announced she was going to be a famous singer when she was 6 years old. When Selma finishes the song, Jackie gives Regina a look and mouths, Alleluia. They both look away. The song already has them both crying, but they're amused too. Too much sorrow has made them ripe for laughter. More eye contact will set them off for reasons they could never explain to Selma. Dad would have loved to hear Selma sing Alleluia. He would have been able to appreciate the song and laugh at the fact she chose it to sing at his deathbed without hurting Selma's feelings. Selma recites a couple psalms and the prayer of St. Francis. She is telling her grandfather to let go and let God, telling him, rise, rise, we'll join you by and by. And Jackie is about to tell her to wrap it up when the nurse with her cart stops by the door. The nurse steps into the room. Oh, she says, I'll give you a few more minutes. Selma turns to Jackie. Can she join us, Auntie? Jackie nods her assent. The nurse kneels next to her at the end of the bed and whispers, such a lovely man. She touches Jackie's arm. Now that I'm officially aware, I have to start the paperwork soon. Of course, Jackie moves her bent leg to make room. It takes less than a minute for her knee to start throbbing. After the early morning funeral, Jackie and Selma go shopping, spend their inheritance on used cars. The farm Jackie's parents worked on most of their adult lives was sold 15 years ago to pay for medical bills her parents incurred during her mom's battle with colon cancer. There's to be no probate court, no tax worries, no lawyer's fees, just a manila envelope with Jackie and Selma's name on it. Inside are 2 leather-sized white envelopes, each containing $5,500 and the same note in shaky script that reads, consider buying a used car. Jake Jr. at A+ on Leonard Avenue will give you a good deal. Say old man Lesbrance is cashing in a favor. He'll know what you mean. Play up the part where I died. Thank you. The end. Well, it's not the end. It's the end of that. What I'm going to read. Thank you so much for listening. I will silence myself.
Thank you so much, Sally. I wrote down the line, too much sorrow make them ripe for laughter, which, yeah, I was feeling very tender throughout that whole reading. So I think that one just kind of captured it for me. So thank you for that. Next, we have Leslia Newman. Leslia Newman has created 75 books for readers of all ages, including the poetry collections October Morning, a song for Matthew Shepard, I Carry My Mother, and her recent collection, I Wish My Father. Those are companion memoirs in verse. She's also the author of notable children's books like Giddle's Journey and Ellis Island's Story, Sparkle Boy, Heather Has Two Mommies, Welcoming Elijah, A Passover Tale, With a Tale, and Quetzal, the Cat Who Composed. With that, I'll let Leslia take the reins.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, and I wasn't prepared to jump in right now because I was so mesmerized with what Sally was reading. Sally, that was just so moving, both the short piece about your own dad and then the excerpt from the novel. You know, your characters are so real, and you have such a way of capturing them in all their brilliant complexity. I just loved it, and I was very, very touched by it. So thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm going to start by reading just a poem or two from I Carry My Mother, because these are a pair of memoirs in verse. And I like to say they go hand in hand, like my parents went hand in hand for 63 years. So And the books are very different because my parents were very different. The poems that I carry my mother are all written in form. So I'm just going to read a few just to set the context. So the book starts with my mom's diagnosis with a long poem. I'm just going to read a few excerpts from it called The Deal. My mother's doctor tells me here's the deal. She's got 6 months to live, a year at most. His words lodge in my gut, a heavy meal. My mother's doctor tells me here's the deal. I'm very sorry, I know how you feel. But keep your chin up, don't give up the ghost. My mother's doctor tells me here's the deal. She's got 6 months to live, a year at most. My father stroked my mother's swollen hand, his broken body bent in half with grief. He stares down at his ancient wedding band. My father stroked my mother's swollen hand. This ending is so far from what they'd planned. His face a wrinkled mask of disbelief. My father stroked my mother's swollen hand, his broken body bent in half with grief. And now my father's heart is full of hope. My mother's had 2 good days in a row. He clings to her, their hands a twisted rope. And now my father's heart is full of hope. And I, the daughter, clueless how to cope, while deep inside my mother's tumors grow. And now my father's heart is full of hope. My mother's had 2 good days in a row. So, you know, as often happens when someone is close to death, somebody who loves them very much is in denial. And my dad really could not comprehend the fact that my mother would not live or would not outlive him, which she did not. And so she was in hospice for 5 days and then she died. And this is a poem about that moment when my mom died. How to watch your mother die. Push open the door. Push yourself into your mother's hospice room. Oh, you know what? This is not the poem I was going to read. I am so sorry. Never did that before. It was this poem I wanted to read. That poem was a little too long. This is called How to Watch Your Father Watch Your Mother Die. Start over. How to watch your father watch your mother die. Sit beside him on a folding chair beside your mother's bed. Place a box of tissues between you. See how he takes your mother's hand in both his own and strokes it like a small, wounded animal. Do not speak. Do not turn on the TV. Do not shatter the silence around you. Let time pass. Listen to your father sigh. Listen to your father sob. Hand your father a tissue whenever necessary. Ask your father if he wants something to eat. Ask your father if he wants something to drink. Ask your father if he wants to go for a walk. Do not press him when he says no to everything. Remember, the one thing he wants is impossible to give him. Let more time pass. When your father gets up to go to the bathroom and says, hold mom's hand, hold your mother's hand. When he returns, give your mother's hand back to your father. It belongs to him. Do not tell your father what the hospice nurse told you. You need to let go so she can let go. When the sun sets, gather the darkened room around your shoulders like a cloak. Watch your father's undying love take your mother's breath away. So I wish my father picks up where that left off. And so I'm going to actually read the first poem in the book. Is actually not written by me. It's written by my dad. It's the only poem he ever wrote, and he wrote it for my 60th birthday and sent it to me. Science tells us that to live, one needs air and water, but to have a better life, one must have a daughter. To have one so talented, caring, and bright even makes old age all right. So, you know, I said to my father, forget the law practice, you should take up poetry. I thought that was pretty good. And, you know, of course, it was so moving to me. All right, so this is the first poem in the book. And these poems, just to tell you about the form, the title acts as the first line of the poem. And so there's really no pause. I'll pause for like a nanosecond, but then it just goes into 3-line verses. When my father wakes up on that first sweltering night of that first scalding summer, soaked in sweat like my mother when she suffered those terrible hot flashes 40 years ago, he stumbles out of bed and lumbers to the archaic air conditioner, fumbling for the right button to bring it back to life with a wheeze and a groan and a thump. Next, he shuffles across the faded carpet, slides between the worn sheets, and lifts the torn blanket to cover my mother, who will surely grow stiff from the frigid air blowing between them as she had for more than 60 years. Who could blame him for forgetting she had left him and was now slumbering on the other side of town, wrapped in a shroud beneath the stony, stubborn ground? How he missed her old, cold shoulder. So my parents had a very traditional marriage. My dad went off to work and made the money, and my mother did everything else. So he really knew nothing about, doing laundry, food shopping, anything like that. So this is a poem about, I actually moved in with him for a little while to help care for him. So this is about the first time we went grocery shopping. And it starts actually with a little fragment of a song. Yes, we have no bananas. My father croons off key as we stroll through the supermarket. Shall we get some, he asks, a standing joke between us. My father hates bananas, peaches, plums, mangoes, anything mushy makes him shudder in disgust. Remember that time I baked you banana bread? I stop our cart to ask. You loved it until I told you what it was, remember? Really? My father says. Impossible. He backs away from the bananas as though they mean him harm. I don't remember. Sure you do, I insist. I put 3 pieces on a plate and you ate them all. It was the summer before I went off to college. My father steers clear of the bananas and pushes the cart towards the deli. Where'd you go to college again, he asks, placing a package of rugelach into the cart. Vermont, I say, removing the rugelach, which is bad for his diabetes. Don't you remember? We drove up and stopped for lunch at that diner in Montpelier, and the one woman working there was seating people, taking orders, cooking, running the register, and Mom felt so sorry for her she offered to leap over the counter and lend a hand, remember? At this, my father brightens. Ah, your mother, he says, she could have done it. She could do anything. Almost anything, I correct him. There was one thing she could never do. I reach for a bag of whole wheat bagels. What's that? My father asks, genuinely curious. She could never get you to eat a banana. That's true. My father's chortle dies in his throat. I would eat every banana in the world just to see her one more time, he says. And we both fall silent, make fists around the handle of our grocery cart, and together we push on. One thing I did with my dad was go through old photo albums, which is something that he enjoyed. He liked talking about the past. So that is a poem about that. This is a poem about that. Who's that? My father asks, jabbing his thick yellow nail at a thin, willowy woman dressed in a beaded evening gown, staring up at us from the pages of my parents' age-old wedding album. I stare back. I don't know, Dad. Mom would know, I think, but do not say. My father squints, adjusts his cockeyed glasses, brings the heavy book closer to his face. It's you, he says, his voice full of triumph. See, the old man still got a few marbles left. That's not me, Dad, I say, hating to deflate him. No? The deep creases in his brow deepen as he lowers the book to his lap, stares at the photo, stares at me. It looks like you, he insists, desperate to be right. Are you sure it's not you? I shake my head. No, Dad, it's not me, I repeat, desperate for him to be in his right mind. This is your wedding album. You got married in 1949. I was born in 1955. My father scowls. The numbers do not add up. Are you positive? He asks sadly. I'm positive, I answer sadly, for more than anything, I want to have been there, to have seen my dreamboat of a dad in his rented top hat and tails, gazing down at my model slim mother in her borrowed veil and lacy gown, to have heard the rabbi's blessing and the smash of the glass beneath my father's foot. I wasn't even a twinkle in your eye, I say, hoping the old cliche will make my father smile. It doesn't. Who is that, he asks again, lifting his eyes towards the sky and rapidly tapping his calloused middle finger against his faded, frowning lips. Who indeed? God only knows, but God isn't saying. Is it Cousin Irma? I ask my father, who smacks himself on the forehead. What a dummy, Cousin Irma, of course that's who it is, he declares, relieved to put a name to the face that looks so much like his clever daughter, who always knows who's who and what's what, and that desperate times call for desperate measures, such as pulling a name, any name, out of a hat, if it will make the worry on her father's worrisome face disappear like magic as he leans forward and slowly but surely turns another page. So my father started having these, the doctor actually called them episodes, where he had some interesting hallucinations, and that's what this poem is about. Heaven can rely on you, sings a chorus of strapping young men in sweet, deep voices that blend inside my father's head. Don't you hear them? He asks, then shrugs, unconcerned about being the sole witness to this tender serenade. He holds up a single finger signaling, wait, wait. The men have stopped, but then they start up again. Gouda, 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 my father sings along. Like the cheese, I tease, trying to make light of this newest delusion. My father frowns. It isn't funny, and cocks his head like a puzzled puppy, trying to make sense of what's being said. The sound, any sound, a precious gift, since he doesn't hear much these days. Not the telephone's startled and startling shriek, not the blasting TV's blathering newscaster, not the neighborhood dog's insistent sharp bark, not the rain's hard hammer against the sliding glass door, and not a peep from the little boy who appears at the foot of his bed night after night, his eyes as blue as my father's before the cataracts floated in, two puffy clouds across his morning sky. Who is he, Dad? I ask. My father shrugs, then lifts his finger again. Yes, dear, he says, I will, dear. He looks towards my mother's chair, and out of nowhere, I hear her too, her words, her voice, the weak whisper of that terrible last day. Don't worry, sweetheart. She cut my cheek with her worn, withered hand. There's no problem so terrible that it can't get worse. Gouda, 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 sings my father happily off key, swaying in his seat, his ancient voice cracking like a young bar mitzvah boy's. Deedle, 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 zizza, zizza, zizza. So after that, I decided we should take my dad to see a neurologist who was kind of an interesting character in and of himself. So this is a poem about that. The first time we visit the neurologist, he gives us exactly 7 minutes of his time. What's 8 plus 15, he asks my father, who gives me a look I know all too well. What is this guy, an imbecile? 8 plus 15 is 23. My father speaks loudly, as if the doctor hears worse than he does. Come on, ask me a real question. My father puts up his dukes and punches the air, eager for a good fight. 8 times 15 is 120. 120 times 15 is 1,800. 1,800 times 15 is 27,000. The poor neurologist has no way of knowing what a math whiz my father is, how he'd entertain us on long car rides by barking out math problems, or better yet, dare me to challenge him. Hey, Dad, what's 11,327 plus 10,695, I'd ask. 22,022, he'd say in a second, waiting for me to work it out in my notebook. He was always right. Hey, Dad, what's 1,000,000 plus 1,000,000, I'd ask, searching my brain for the biggest number in the universe. 1,000,000 trillion, he'd answer. Hey, Dad, what's 1,000,000 trillion plus 1,000,000 trillion? A bazillion, he'd say, shaking his head so fast his cheeks turned to rubber and I'd crack up. If only we were laughing now, but the neurologist is not amused. He leans forward to study his puzzle of a patient. Where were you born? He asks. Brooklyn, naturally, my father says, as if the doctor should know that anyone who was anyone was born in Brooklyn. What did you do for a living? My father sits up a little taller. I'm an attorney, still practicing. The neurologist looks to me to confirm that either this is true or that my father has gone bananas. Yup, I say, hoping to convey that this is a real problem. The neurologist does not catch on. Who's running for president? He asks my father, who is now convinced that the doctor is completely bonkers. Hillary and that son of a bitch, he bellows, causing the two receptionists out front to break into peals of squealing laughter. He's fine. The doctor leans back and glances up at the clock to let me know I've wasted enough of his time. He's great. Take him home. My father is already out of his seat. But what about his delusions, I ask? The men singing in his head, the little boy at the foot of his bed. The neurologist shrugs. Old people have delusions, he says, pulling open his file cabinet's top drawer. Clearly done with me and my father, who was already out in the waiting room, waving my coat by the shoulders like a matador taunting a bull, then hustling me down the hallway. Come on, let's go, shake a leg. Clearly, we have more important things to do than deal with this nonsense. And this doctor, who I know my father thinks is a real nut job and will never again agree to see, not next week, not next month, not in a bazillion years. So shortly after that, this happened. It was not a stroke of genius. It was not a stroke of luck. It was a stroke of misfortune that befell my father, leaving him crumpled at the foot of the driveway next to the garbage, waiting all morning to be picked up. So after that, it was pretty clear that my father couldn't keep living by himself. He had a series of these episodes and he got more forgetful and he kept having these hallucinations. And so we had to figure out what was going to happen. So here is a poem about that. On the day we discussed my father giving up his practice, selling his house and moving to independent living, we sat at the kitchen table and I shouted, not too loudly, but loudly enough for him to hear the questions he didn't want to hear. I couldn't blame him for turning away from me without a word, looking left, then right, then fixing his gaze on a stubborn spot of spaghetti sauce above the stove, squinting his faded blue eyes as he tried to envision an impossible future, or perhaps finally reading the writing on the wall. I watched as he rapidly tapped the thick yellow nail of his calloused middle finger of his left hand against his jutting lower lip, like he always did when he knew he'd gotten himself into a jam he couldn't get out of. After a long time, he heaved a sigh of sorrow, shrugged his shrunken shoulders, and shook his heavy head. All right. He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender, saying what I wanted and didn't want to hear. I'll give it a year, he said, as if he was doing me a favor. And then what? I hadn't asked, as I swung into action, making 1,000 calls, writing 100 checks, doing all that needed to be done so that he could retire, sell the house, and move. He lasted exactly 11 months and 27 days, always a man of his word. I just have two more shortish poems. My father was never on time once in his entire life. We could always count on him being a good 20 minutes early. I remember many a Saturday night with my father dressed to the nines in his sleek black tux and glittering diamond studs, pacing the hallway from front door to kitchen to dining room before ordering me to dash upstairs and see what was taking my impossible mother so goddamn long. I'd find her sitting side saddle on a stool in a white silk slip surrounded by crumpled tissues implanted with lip prints of lipstick the color of apples, clasping a sparkling bracelet around her wrist, clipping on a pair of matching earrings and muttering to herself in the bedroom mirror, "I know the early bird catches the worm, but who the hell wants a goddamn worm?" She'd hand me a pendant shaped like a tear to fasten around her neck, then raise a silver aerosol can, the hairspray hissing like a snake as she circled her head 3 times, forcing me to step back from the cloud that always made me cough. Once, I came home from college for Thanksgiving, and my father drove me to the airport for my return on a snowy Sunday afternoon. Somehow, my stuffed to the gills suitcase never made it out to the car. After he finished yelling and screaming and carrying on, my father drove us home and drove us back to the airport, and I was still an hour early for my flight. It made me laugh when my father proudly showed me a note he received after my mother died. "Dear Mr. Newman, thank you for coming to my bar mitzvah. You were the first one there." I wonder just how early he was and how on earth he would feel to learn that from this day forth, for all time, he will always and forever be known as the late Mr. Newman. That really would kill my father. And this is the last poem in the book. So the book begins with my parents being separated with my mom's death, and it ends with them being reunited wherever they are with my dad's death. My mother is at the bridge table with Loretta, Gert, and Pearl when my father finds his way to heaven. "Sit down, dear," she says, patting the seat beside her and barely looking up from the hand she's been dealt. "The game is almost through." But my father is too overcome to sit. He stands and stares at his beloved, free of wheelchair and oxygen tank, happily puffing away on a Chesterfield King held between 2 perfectly manicured fingers, sipping a cup of instant Maxwell House coffee, leaving a bright red lip print on the white china cup. Her hair, the lovely chestnut brown it was the day they met. Her face, free of worry lines, the diamond pendant he bought her on their first trip to Europe glittering against her ivory throat. She looks like the star of an old black and white movie who would never give him the time of day, but somehow spent 63 years by his side. "I missed you," my father tells my mother, leaning down to kiss her offered cheek. "Of course you did," said my mother, who always knows everything. She plays her cards right, and after Loretta and Pearl and Gert fold, she stands to let my father take her in his arms, and in their heavenly bodies, they dance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslia. That was wonderful. Yeah, I think those both readings from Sally had led us this evening with that image of the evergreen, and thinking about how it represents relevance and shelter. And I'm listening to Leslia's poems, especially the banana one, but so many of them. And the 2 words that are popping out for me is like witnessing and endurance, right? The noticing and tending that comes with especially parents late in life, but just adults late in life. There's so much here. I wanted to ask a question of the both of you to start off that is about writing, but sideways, which is that I know you both are old friends and part of a broader writing community here in Northampton. And I wondered if you could speak a bit about how you met and perhaps the ways writing helped you kind of foster community here in Northampton or beyond, just to kind of give us a picture of that world in which you two met and created this artistic friendship.
I was thinking as you were reading, Leslia, that I had met both your parents, more than once. And I was thinking about how intimate the poems were and the story that it told, and how honored I felt sort of to be able to follow that story, and how funny some of the stuff was to me, just like, because I had such a picture of both your parents in my mind. But how we met, how did we actually first meet? I remember you on Day Avenue, and even before Day Avenue on Orchard Street. I shouldn't be saying where you live, but I was but I remember you on Street.
But I don't live there
Street.
anymore.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
So, how did we?
Well, did we meet when you took my
did,
writing
yes.
class?
I think so. Yeah.
Yes. So
in
that
the
was on
80s.
Holly Street, I think, right on the
Holly
second
Street, yes,
floor
Yes,
in the 80s.
yes.
And it has been such a joy to watch you, to be friends with you all these years, and to watch your writing grow, and to, read your novels, which I'm just so impressed with. And Sally is a closet poet. She has written some poems. I know, because I published one in an anthology that I edited, right? So Your Secret is out.
Yeah.
For me, in terms of community, we're so rich in this valley with so many wonderful writers and communities, the LGBTQ writers community, the poetry community, the children's book community. It sustains me so much. And I think that is what I was looking for, actually, when I left Manhattan and moved here, to find an intimate, nurturing community where I feel like, as writers, we support each other. I don't really feel competition with anyone. I feel like when one of us succeeds, all of us succeeds. And I'm just so, so grateful for that. And Sally, you are definitely a big part of that.
Yeah, as you are. We're very, very fortunate in this area. And the community does sustain us, for sure. Absolutely.
Thank
it's a
you
lovely thing.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I know Molly just mentioned it in the chat, but if you have questions for Leslie and Sally, you can load them into the chat and we'll read them back. But I wanted to, I've got a couple questions prepared, and Sally, I thought I might start with you. In a note in an email that emails we are exchanging in anticipation of tonight, and in part of your bio, you've mentioned some of the concerns and themes of your writing, right? And that's came out tonight: class, illness, aging. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about your experience as a nurse, and how that perhaps helped make clear some of those connections to all those big themes that you explore in your writing. I worked as a CNA for almost a decade, and so that work is something that I care about deeply, and also informed how I think about writing too. So I'm curious what you might have to say about that.
Well, it's surely informed, my writing about the body. I mean, you can't. It's huge. I did not realize until I was an aide before I became a nurse. And so when I became a nurse, I was so shocked with how much I knew, because there was other students in nursing school who just didn't know just how close in you had to be a nurse, to be, just getting that tight to a body. If you want to be a nurse, you have to be willing to be very close to a body. And that is so true of writing. If you want to write about humans, then you need to be tight to a body. So it's very, in that way, being a nurse and being a writer are very joined. So, and also detail that, there's so many things about nursing. I've thought this a lot, that are very parallel to writing. You better get the detail down when you're a nurse, or something is going to get by you that is going to be very bad for your patient, or very bad for your client. I'm an old lady, so I still say patient sometimes. But, and not just describing, but the feeling that, you must know the body to be a nurse, and you must know the body, even if you're not writing directly about the body. You must know the body to write about human beings. You just must. And also, I think you have to have some kind of humility to be a decent nurse, to decently work with people in any way.
Yeah, I was scribbling down, you must know the body. I mean, I just feel like that's it's something that I was aware of in hearing you read from Fishwives, and then your piece from the nonfiction piece as well. So thank you for those reflections. There's a couple wonderful questions that are coming in the chat, and Leslie, maybe I'll pose one to you, but it's open to both of you. Carolyn Cushing is asking, what are your thoughts on the role, responsibility, or possibility of the writer in this time of the pandemic? They say in time of pandemic death. Yeah, any thoughts on that, Leslia, in terms of how have you moved into your role as a writer in this time, or how has it shifted?
So when the pandemic began, I really thought about, what can I do? I mean, there were some obvious things like write letters, protest, take care of myself. But I thought, what can I do with my specific skill set? And so what I did, which I thought was so important, I initiated a project with the Straw Dogs Writers Guild. Let me see if I can remember, writing in the time of Corona, pandemic, poetry and prose, I think it was. And so we put out a call and collected 150 pieces of writing by local writers and posted one piece of writing a day. And I felt like that was something, a gift that we could give the community, both the writers, a place to express what they were going through, and readers so that they could read other people's work and hopefully relate to it. So I feel like, as a writer, and of course, I've written a bunch of poems and pieces about the pandemic and current events, because I feel like the pandemic of systemic racism is also something, obviously that's happening now. I think that with being a successful writer, which, I can't deny that I am, comes a responsibility to give voice to the voiceless, and to be a community servant and leader, and just do my part to heal the world. So that's how I feel I'm taking action during this time.
Thank you for that. And yeah, Sally, any thoughts on that, or anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with Leslie about, using your writing for activism. There's did a thing, Writers Against Trump. I don't know if anybody else did that, but so there was that. And then, you write your postcards, you write to your Congress people, all of that. But, as far as writing itself goes, I think, the pandemic has made me think even more about writing, writing with tenderness, and with, writing the truth about suffering, writing the sort of the not turning away from, what it means to die, what it means to be ill, what it means to be in the middle of hard stuff, not turning away from that. But doing it with tenderness, and with, the corny, it's the corny word love, but putting yourself out there and doing it with some humanity. I think the pandemic has brought that out, I think, hopefully, in most of us. Yeah.
Thank you for those reflections. I mean, Susan Stinson was also asking a question that kind of related to this. So I wonder if we can just kind of stay here for one more moment. But Susan was writing, both of you read about your late fathers, the late Mr. Newman, the Dead Man's Float. And she was wondering, how does the context of the pandemic and the terrible mounting death toll echo or interact with your writing about your specific beloved fathers and their deaths? Do those things overlap or amplify those feelings? Something else? It's a lovely question. I'll offer it up to whoever wants to try and tackle that one.
Well, when I was thinking about my dad in terms of the pandemic, I was actually very happy that he was no longer on the planet, which might sound a little weird because I miss him so fiercely.
Mhm.
But this would have been so incredibly difficult for him, as he was, he never had an official diagnosis of Alzheimer's or anything like that. But, he was suffering from dementia, and he was mostly deaf. And I think for him to try and understand what was going on, and I know this isn't really answering your question, but this is what I'm thinking about. And having to wear a mask and having to be in isolation, I just really don't think he could have handled it. My mom would have been fine. But so, I thought about that a lot. And I did have an aunt who died of COVID. So I have been thinking about her a lot. So, in the grand scheme of things, there's just so many people suffering great losses right now. So I hope that my books about both my parents can maybe bring some comfort to people who are also mourning. I know that when I have read books written by other people about loss in their life, it has brought me comfort because I can relate to it.
Yeah. I happen to be writing right now about a man who's 40, and he is a man who is just profoundly intellectually challenged, pre-birth mentality. I work for decades with people who are profoundly intellectually challenged. And so he's a 40-year-old man who's probably 3 feet tall. He has multiple physical problems, and he can't speak. He can hear, but he's legally blind. So this pandemic has just brought home to me, about the isolation and vulnerability, and that just how certain people have always felt this, And like Leslia, my dad would have not done well with this, and my mom, who is still alive, is fine. She has dementia, but she every time you tell her about it, she's like, well, we've lived through this and we've lived through that. And so it's interesting that who's vulnerable and why and when, but the isolation and the anxiety and the vulnerability, how we take care of each other. That's what the pandemic is really bringing home to me, how we take care of each other, and sort of the tenderness. How do you get there? And why do sometimes you feel tender and sometimes you just feel anger? All the feeling stuff. Why? And how do you evoke these things in each other? And what brings them out? I don't know. So I've been playing with that.
I mean, I feel like, yeah, what draws out tenderness and what draws out anger feel unsettled questions that for sure the pandemic has pushed to the fore in so many ways. I feel like it was very hard to describe. Just for my own family, my parents are rather conservative, and so the turn towards masks was something they really were hesitant around at first, and trying to describe it as kind of like a pro-social thing, a thing to indicate that you care about the strangers that you see, and how perhaps not wearing one can be seen as giving the finger to the world. That was a hard line to actually kind of communicate. And just thinking about how, I don't know, there's more to say about all these things. I'm noticing a couple other questions, and this one I'm going to pose it to Leslia because it's who it's asked to, but it's something that I think we could apply to Sally as well. But Lynette is wondering, Leslia, how long do you spend kind of getting your poems technically right? Lynette was cheering that they always flow so naturally, but she's curious about, how she's assuming that's not an automatic process, and wondering how do you kind of, make them whole?
Oh no, they just come out like that. No, I'm kidding. I had a teacher in college who used the word pester. So I kind of like that word, that I pester the poems over and over and over until I find, I get them where I think that they sound right. But, each poem, goes through, you know, a good 20, 25 drafts. I read them out loud. I work with line breaks. I work with sound as much as I work with meaning. And often I will choose a word for the sound more than the meaning, which is something that Jack Kerouac did. But, you know, I've put in can't remember if it's 10,000 or 100,000 hours, you know, because I've been writing for so long, more than half a century. And so, you know, when one has a writing practice, and I know a lot of the people who are watching also have a very devoted writing practice, you develop your intuition. So you know when something really kind of hits the mark. It's almost like you breathe a little differently when you know, get that aha moment, and you know that you've, like a gymnast, like you've landed. But it takes a long time to get there. And you know, the poems they're really worked to death pretty much. I have notebooks and notebooks and notebooks. So I write everything out in longhand. So I have all these notebooks with all these drafts. Sally, what about you?
Yeah,
I'm a rewrite. I rewrite. I write, rewrite. I write on the computer, then I print it out, then I rewrite it on the page, then I go back to the computer, then I read it out loud. I couldn't even exaggerate the amount of rewriting I do. And I read aloud a lot.
I was gonna ask, I'm also a like print out and edit kind of person. I have a soggy cardboard box filled with all those printouts that I may never look at again, but I can't get rid of. You know,
confusing, isn't it?
yeah, one of those boxes. But Sally, I'm curious, you know, for you especially, right? There's kind of it's been about almost 10 years between Girls Club and Fishwives, right? Were you in revision for much of that time with Fishwives, or yeah?
Well, it was 10 years before, but it was agent had it for several years, so it was probably 6 years. So it was like, and then it landed with Bywater, and so then it's been a year with Bywater. So, but those 6 years, yes, I was revising. I wrote a bunch of short stories from Fishwives, which have been published and won a couple awards and such. So, and then I wasn't writing Fishwives for a while, but I was writing it more that time than not. And I'm slow. And I did have a bunch of other stuff published in between, but yeah.
I mean,
short stories.
I'd say 3 cheers for slowness. I think that's
I'm a slow cooker. Yeah, I'm a crock pot.
Yeah. You know, I was just going to say, thinking about not to necessarily return us there, but just to kind of remember where we've been in our conversation. You know, Susan was wondering if the specificity of the detail of your stories about losing fathers, how reading them or returning to them in this time may have changed them. And I know for me, kind of hearing both of you read this evening, hearing the specificity of love, hearing the kind of the mundane of tending and of companionship, whether it's again at the grocery store or at a hospital bed before paperwork begins, those simple things that are often when we're living them, cannot feel like the stuff of poetry or the stuff of a lyric sentence, but can instead just feel like more life. I think in a time when so much has been lost, that kind of specificity can really return me in hearing it, to really championing those mundane moments and those small moments. So I just want to thank you both for that. And I think that's something that this reading is giving me this evening. I'll open up for just any other final questions from the group. If people want to throw something in the chat, again, it's there. Beyond that, I had another question for Leslie. I'll just throw out real quick and see what happens here. It's kind of connected to the question about your work with your poetry. You've written children's books, memoirs in verse, poems across all these kinds of different genres. And I wanted to know, for you, no doubt the genres are talking to each other in different ways, but I'm curious what your poetry learned from writing a children's book, what the children's book learned from writing a memoir in verse. I'm curious about how, in your growth as a writer, these different genres have helped you learn new things about what the page can do for you.
So I started off as a poet, writing poems for adults. I've been writing poems since I was a teenager. So that's my background. And then when I started writing children's books, I learned very quickly that they're very similar, whether or not the children's book text is in verse or not, because the most similar thing is the succinctness. You have very few words to say something. A children's book nowadays, really 500 words is pretty much all you get. I mean, there are exceptions. So, and I learned a lot that a stanza break, a page turn can act like a stanza break. A break of a stanza gives you just a minute to pause. And, if you have children, or if you've ever read a book to a child, there's that anticipation before you turn the page and something happens. So that the stanza break and the page turn work the same. Children's book can use a lot of literary devices like poetry, such as sound, of course, rhythm, rhyme, alliteration, again, whether or not it's in prose or verse. And I really highly, highly recommend all poets to try writing children's books. First of all, it's fun. And second of all, you can support your poetry habit by writing children's books. So that's kind of what has happened for me. And, it's been working pretty well. I mean, you can earn thousands of dollars by writing a poem that becomes the text of a children's book. So I throw that out as a challenge to the poets who are listening, to try your hand at a children's book and see what happens. Children love rhyme and repetition and sound and all of those things. But, I feel like a lot of people ask me, do you prefer writing poetry or prose or children's books or books for adults? And to me, it's all writing. As long as I am spilling words onto a page, I'm happy.
I love that. And I'm also writing down like get $1,000 write poem for child. So
do it,
okay,
do it.
Done. That's tomorrow's work.
Yeah.
But I think, thinking about the anticipation of turning the page and relating that to a stanza, I think just brings back to that magic that can actually happen on a page. When you're writing, or just when you're reading as well, what's going to happen next, how punctuation can really make or break a moment, all these kinds of things. I'm going to post in the chat one more time live links to Fishwives out from Bywater Books and Leslia's latest, I Wish My Father, for you to check out. If there are no more questions, then I just want to thank Leslia and Sally for being with us tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you all at home or otherwise Zooming in to this experience this evening. Just take care, be well, lean towards tenderness more than anger.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.